be able to finally present it given the vagaries of COVID-19. Before we begin anything, I would like to especially thank Joanna Nijińska, our former director, who had the brilliant idea of inviting Clare and has done so much work to organize this. So thank you to Joanna.
I'm really glad that Clare can be with us with 6 months or 8 months delay.
Wonderful. We're going to start out by having an introduction by the Dean of the Hamilton Luger School, Dean Lee Feinstein, who the former ambassador to Poland. Then I'll introduce Clare, and Clare will speak. If you have questions for Clare, we're happy to take them in the chat, and I will ask them to Clare later. I think that's going to be easier than trying to manage hands raised and so on. So if you have questions, please put them into the chat. Lee, do you want to start us off?
Super. Clare, welcome. Well done in overcoming the technological challenges.
Oh, man. Yes.
It's always difficult, particularly when you know people are waiting. And Elizabeth, congratulations on your being the chair of Polish Studies. Thank you so much for this invitation. This is always one of my favorite events every year. Joanna, another good choice for the Wiles lecture, so well done. So it's a real pleasure to see everyone. And just welcome to everyone, including and especially past chairs of the Polish Studies Center, which is such a great resource for the Hamilton Luger School and for all of IU and beyond. So I'm doing the honors to welcome you to the 8th annual Timothy Wiles lecture. To save time, I'll let Elizabeth do the formal introduction of Professor Cavanagh. But just to say that, as everyone on this call knows, she's widely acclaimed for her translations of poetry from Polish to English. It's suitable given the great IU tradition of in that space, including especially Bill Johnston. Professor Cavanagh's translation of Adam Zagajewski's Asymmetry won the Harold Langdon Prize for Translation from the American Academy of Poets in 2018. It's also a finalist for the National Book Award, and among many other honors, she's received the PEN Book of the Month Prize for Outstanding Literary Translation, which she and Stanisław Baranczyk won for the translation of Szymborska's View with a Grain of Sand. So it's my pleasure to say just a few words about the person for whom this talk is named, Timothy Wiles. Timothy Wiles had a special gift to connect people, institutions, and oceans across political divides. Many of you on this call had the privilege of working with him and experiencing his ability to connect people and also his great intellectual work. He was born in Norway, Maine. He attended public schools there. He got his bachelor's degree at Antioch College, not far from here in Yellow Springs, Ohio. And then he got his doctorate at Stanford in English. And then he joined IU in faculties of English and Comp Lit. And he taught courses in these and other departments through the summer of 2003. His academic interests were drama and performance studies. And he became particularly interested in Polish culture in 1971, when he spent a year in Poland directing plays at a student theater festival in Wrocław. The dissertation that resulted from his stay there was published by Chicago Press in 1980 under the title, The Theater Event, Modern Theories of Performance. And in addition to an outstanding academic record, he was also really essential in the formation of the Polish Studies Center and also IU's longstanding partnership with the American Studies Center at Warsaw University. I can just tell you from my own personal experience that the American Studies Center has produces many of the most talented people interested in the relationship between the United States and Poland. And I worked with and was privileged to have the expertise of several graduates who work and continue to work at the U.S. Embassy in Warsaw, particularly in interpretation and in cultural affairs, which is so important to the work of any diplomat. Following the establishment of the American Studies Center in Warsaw, Tim Wiles established the Polish Studies Center here in Bloomington in 1977, and that's a partnership that remains vibrant. Joanna Nijińska and others were in Warsaw with university president to kind of reinvigorate and cement our continued cooperation. Let me just also thank a couple of our donors as well. Roberta Adams, Eleanor Valentine, Michael Osbrook, and Charles Bergens for their tremendous support of the work that we do, and also the excellent work of the Executive Committee of the Polish Studies Center for their tremendous commitment to this program. So with that, Elizabeth, let me hand the floor over to you, and thanks again for this invitation, and thanks Claire for joining us. We're really grateful and look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks so much, Lee. That's a lovely introduction. I'm so pleased to be able to introduce Clare Cavanagh, who is one of the most acclaimed literary critics and translators working today. She's currently Francis Hooper Professor in the Arts and Humanities at Northwestern University, where she teaches in Slavic languages and literatures. Her book, Lyric Poetry and Modern Politics, Russia, Poland, and the West, received the 2010 National Book Critics Circle Award for Criticism and was named an Outstanding Academic Book of the Year by Choice magazine. In addition to all the fantastic awards that Lee mentioned that have been given for Professor Cavanagh's translations, she has also been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters, been awarded the John Frederick Nims Memorial Prize in Translation, and she has been published in the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, Poetry Magazine, and other prestigious venues. And that is just the start of, if I read the whole list, we'd be here all day. I have been a huge fan of Clare's work for many years. So perhaps in addition to telling you how remarkable other people think she is, I can tell you a little bit about what's remarkable about this work. In both her criticism and her translation, she has an amazing gift for capturing not just the bones of an author's work, that is its semantic meaning, but its tone, its geist, all the subtle things that tell you not just what an author says, but who the author is. Reading her translations of Szymborska, you have a sense of Szymborska's wistfulness, her ineffable fragility, her fascination with the minute details that others might find prosaic. And I have to say, Clare, that when I first read your translation of Cat in an Empty Apartment, I actually burst into tears. It was like so profoundly moving, that poem. And when I've read it in other translations, it's not quite as moving. In Clare Cavanagh's translations of Zagajewski, you can feel, for example, his constant discomfort and sense of always being out of place. So we find out so much about who these poets are as well as what they say. Clare is now working on a biography of the poet and essayist Czesław Miłosz, about whom she will tell us more today. Thank you, Clare Cavanagh, for joining us. The floor is yours.
You'll need to unmute
Sorry
yourself.
for the technical difficulties. I'm always rattled by internet anyhow. I'm starting to do the Zoom thing a little better with my classes, but my basic understanding of it is the machines are out to get me. So, which was validated today. I do have a PowerPoint. I'm primitive at it. It's kind of a love-hate relationship, but with the talk I'm giving, so much of it depends on images that I'm going to give it a shot anyhow. My undergraduates adore patronizing me for my lack of technological ability. So feel free to join in. Let me put up the share screen here. And I also just want to say a thank you to everybody, including especially Joanna, who has been trying to get this thing together for so long, but everybody there has been so wonderful in helping me through and sticking with this in spite of global obstacles, truly, genuinely global obstacles. I was talking to my son about this today, and he said, "Oh, you're going to be so sorry you don't get to go to Bloomington." And it's true. I've been twice, and I've had the most wonderful visits every time. So thank you, at least for thank you all of you for making this cyber lecture possible. Well, I am working very slowly on a biography of Miłosz, and I wanted to begin my talk by talking about why I'm doing what I'm doing. There's already a biography out there. Poles keep saying there's one, that's enough. That's Andrzej Franaszek, who did a magnificent work of scholarship, radically abbreviated for the English version. And one of my short answers to the doubters, I mean, Miłosz himself gave me the go-ahead, so I was okay, is California. It's precisely what I've got in my title. So I wanted to introduce you to how I got into this project and why this part of it, I think, is crucially significant. I'm a Californian myself. I grew up on the opposite side of the bay from Miłosz. So I grew up in Silicon Valley when it was still the Santa Clara Valley. I was at the southwest end of the bay. He was at the northeast end of the bay. And the stuff he describes about California, his knowledge of California history, his knowledge of minute details of flora and fauna, is something that's always kind of enraptured me. I told him, in fact, that the Bay Area, pre-Silicon Valley Bay Area, when middle-class people actually had views of the bay instead of gazillionaires, was my version of Szczecin, his hometown, his home village in Lithuania. So that's where I'm coming from. And the thing is that I've learned so much about California from reading Miłosz. And then I bring that over to Poland. And it's like it's a revelation to people. So I'm going to show you something. I'll show you a brief timeline here and then explain something about my experience of talking about California and America. His knowledge of American history and culture is phenomenal. But this is a quote from 1964. He's in Berkeley. I'll go over to the chronology in just a moment. You've let yourself, can everybody see it okay? Okay, yay, okay. 2 scores today. You've let yourself get trapped in that dance in the European courtyard while the 20th century is playing out elsewhere. What fascinates me is the mystery of America and above all, California. This is Miłosz writing to his editor in Paris, editor and kind of frenemy, Jerzy Giedroyc, the editor of the journal Kultura, the Polish immigrant journal in which Miłosz primarily published. So this is what he writes then. And then I've done this kind of cartoon chronology of Miłosz. I wanted to fit it onto one page here, but it has only one real purpose. So, because I've omitted like 99.7% of his life. He's born in Szczecin, Lithuania, so northeast corner of Lithuania, in 1911, or as he told his friend and scholar, Alexander Fiut, he was born in the 17th century. It just happened to take place in 1911 in rural Lithuania. Family moves to Vilnius in 1921. Just to give you a suggestion of how much I'm omitting here, at the age of 3, he traveled on the Trans-Siberian Railroad with his father, who was a civil engineer. So at the age of 3, the one thing he says he remembers from that is the urinal because he couldn't reach it. At the age of 7, again, he was in what was still Imperial Russia with his family, his father, the civil engineer. At the time, the revolution broke out, and he says he learned Russian from revolutionary soldiers who were quartered in the same building as his family. That's just to give you a hint of what I'm leaving out. So scholarship to Paris, moves to Warsaw, most of the war in Warsaw, joins forces, although doesn't join the party, immediately following the war, and gets, as you can see, the prime postings in the diplomatic corps, Paris, but primarily New York and DC. That's when his work as, I would say, a genuinely brilliant Americanist begins. One of the main missions of his work when he's in New York and DC is to educate Poles about America. He has essays on Melville. He has a translation from Faulkner. He has a translation from William Carlos Williams that actually surfaces in the beginning of the final chapter of The Captive Mind. It's taken almost verbatim from William Carlos Williams. He's translating African-American spirituals. He's translating, I think, 18th century American poetry is as far back as he goes, and writing about it constantly. So this is what's going on there. And it's the beginning of his career as an Americanist. He breaks with People's Poland, ends up stranded in France. He can't get a visa back to the States because of his affiliation with People's Poland. Spends a decade that he later calls the worst decade of his life in France, with all sorts of pro-communist, pro-Stalinist, even intellectuals despising him for his affiliation with breaking with People's Poland, and an immigrant community despising him for having been affiliated with People's Poland. 1960, this changes. He gets 2 invitations to teach in the United States. One of them is Indiana. The other one is Berkeley. So Indiana should be congratulated on its excellent attempt to get a proto-Nobel Prize winner into its ranks early on. He picks Berkeley for a variety of reasons, not least his wife and his family. So he starts teaching 60. I think by 61, he's promoted from lecturer to professor, of which he's very proud because his only credential is a master's degree in law. 1980 wins the Nobel Prize. 1993, I'm sorry, this is what biographers do. There's a mistake in the English language chronology in Franaszek's book. It says he moves to Krakow full-time in 1993. He does not. He moves there part-time. I can't pinpoint the exact year. I'd have to go back and check. That he divides his time between Krakow and California. So this famous house he lives in up in the Berkeley Hills, the house at Grizzly Peak, is his part-time residence up until around 1999, I think. Then he dies in Krakow. Okay, so I go over to Poland 2011, start talking about Miłosz as a Californian and American writer, talk about his really granular knowledge of not just American culture, but specifically Californian culture, and things that I was brought up knowing one way, he knew in a much deeper and richer way, as I found out. My own education in Californian history was sort of overturned by Miłosz, in fact. I knew the places he camped in. They're the places my family camped in. I know the places he traveled in. He traveled as much as Nabokov, all across the Southwest particularly, and across up and down the West Coast. So he knows this stuff intimately, and it influences his work in all kinds of ways. I say this at a conference in 2011. I give a little talk on it at a conference of Miłosz scholars and Miłosz aficionados in Sena, near his mother's family estate. And even a super famous, excellent Miłosz scholar, Marek Zaleski, says, my God, this is all new to me. I say he spent the 4 most productive decades of his life in the United States, and no one here has even mentioned it, talked about various ways in which it had shaped his work, and in which he shaped American poetry by way of his own knowledge of American poetry that he brought to bear on his Polish language writing. And Marek Zaleski says, oh my gosh, I always thought America for him was just the air-conditioned nightmare, Henry Miller's famous phrase. Well, even to do that quotation means you're kind of misreading Miłosz. Miłosz knew Miller, knew his work, they had a falling out. And Miłosz himself identifies this, being hostile to America is part of being an American writer. Being critical of America is part of being an American writer. And he's a Polish-Lithuanian American writer. And so that's how I kind of got into this. What I'm going to be doing here is giving you a poem. I'm giving it to you in my English translation because Miłosz never translated it. I have it up here, and I'm going to be going back and forth initially between the lines of the poem. And then I said I have love-hate relationship with the internet. For researching Miłosz, it has been like the most phenomenal experience because you can track down one reference after another via the internet. So what I've done here is track down the references to this untranslated poem. He intentionally didn't translate it for reasons that I'll suggest later, that dates from 67 and is published in Kultura in 68. It's called Written in the Early Morning on Telegraph Avenue. And what I'm going to kind of do here is talk you through a bit of it. It's long, it's rambling. I can't go through all of it. And then show you exactly the realia that he's embedded in here. What Franaszek says in Miłosz Biografia, the Polish edition, is that the poet was always a sympathetic onlooker who did not participate in his adoptive homeland's culture and society. One poem, I think I just slammed that one into the ground. Absolutely not the case. Look at this poem and you'll start seeing what I mean. In Berkeley, where comely girls stroll barefoot, classic Miłosz, he's checking out the girls. Bearded boys bind their foreheads with bands like redskins, and he uses this term ironically. One of his preoccupations is actually with native culture in both California and the United States. I think he's ironizing the hippie, the would-be native garb of the hippies here. In Berkeley on Telegraph Avenue, at the hour when ships laden with soldiers and a substance for scorching people set forth from a bay gleaming to its golden gate, where no one believed wise men and preachers, and the heretic's prophecy came to pass. For the great whore, the quotations are there in the original, and when he uses quotations, this is a poem about citing various sources, most of which can't be found in the encyclopedias. The great whore had overtaken the Christian church. And here's the second of his quotations. On one of the so-called psychedelic posters, he gives the phrase in English. So he's introducing in a Polish poem the vocabulary of 60s Berkeley, advertising some happening, again in English in the original poem. I read these words: "May the baby Jesus shut your mouth and open your mind." Okay, I'm gonna scroll down here and find you the pictures that show you exactly what he's talking about and how topical it is. This is Telegraph Avenue. I know it because I went to the most countercultural school in the 70s, UC Santa Cruz. We used to go up to Telegraph Avenue, on the weekends. The greatest freak show on earth. This is the pulse of hippie culture, counterculture in 1960s America. We see ships laden with soldiers and a substance for scorching people. This is San Francisco Bay is one of the great ports for sending troops and materiel to Vietnam. The train stations actually came right into Berkeley. A lot of the protests were right there in Berkeley. And this is the kind of sight he might have been seeing. And a substance for scorching people, he's, in a paraphrastic way, if I have time, I'll mention why I think he does it this way. He's talking about napalm. So he's being absolutely topical. And that's an engaged term, saying a substance for scorching people. He doesn't want to leave this as just a neutral word, a neutral term. He talks about street preachers. Well, he has one specific street preacher in mind here. If you look at his essays, Visions, how does it translate? Visions from San Francisco Bay, Visions over San Francisco. Let me check here on the translation. Anyhow, not important. The essay collection in Polish is completed in 1969. It's the capstone on the 60s, his 60s Berkeley Bay Area experience. This preacher, he talks about him in Visions from San Francisco Bay, is Holy Hubert, who was sort of a popular figure. He and Miłosz both have cyber plaques sort of in the Berkeley Hall of Fame, something else I looked up. They have a walking path you can take with little cyber guides all the way through it, who was preaching on the streets of Berkeley all the time and was kind of treated with amused tolerance by the students, as you can see here, like all kind of smiling, the bearded guy laughing in the background, a hippie chick kind of looking bored. They followed him, they tolerated him, but he's hitting on all these themes in a primitive way that Miłosz is dealing with: communism, Marxism, Leninism, Jesus Christ, Second Coming, apocalypse, and so forth. The poster and the bookstore he enters. Tracking down the poster was creepily easy for me. My husband is an encyclopedic musicologist of rock and roll, and he has an enormous collection of psychedelic posters. So all I have to do is either go into the living room or look in one of his books. I've tracked down this poster specifically. The date is right. It's a concert from 1966. It has the exact quotation he gives there, but this quotation became popular. How do why do I assume it's this one? May the baby Jesus shut your mouth and open your mind. Well, he takes his line break straight from the poster. He reproduces the phrase in English, the little quotation in English, and then puts it in translation. He's doing what he does later in the poem. He's borrowing line breaks from forms of visual / verbal art that he finds along Telegraph Avenue. He talks about making his way through the hippies to get into the bookstore. This is it. I don't know if it's Cody's bookstore or not, but there's a bookstore, and this is what he would have walked past on his way into the bookstore. What happens when he goes into the bookstore? I had to break this up. This is a really hard poem for the technologically challenged to reproduce here. He sees the poster, reproduces it here in this poem. Later at Cody's books, I passed the flower stands and hippies squatting on the sidewalk and flipped through reproductions of Bruegel and Rembrandt until I came upon a little book bearing the name of Ben Shahn. Well, what's this about? He's gone straight for the art section. He's looked at two classic realists in alphabetical order, BR. Then he comes up to Ben Shahn. So he's giving us a walking tour that reproduces what he himself is going through. And I had to break this up here. That famous painter, whom I often used to see, born in 1898 in Kovno, Russia. Well, the Eastern Europeanists among you, which I think is probably most of you, if not all of you, will realize instantly that this is a mistake and it's in quotations. Again, this is where my years of shoe shopping experience online turned out to be helpful to me as a researcher. I really know how to track stuff down. I found the book. You can buy it for about $6 on Abe Books. And what the phrase he takes here, I only have the cover here. It was very old and in bad shape, but I'll give you a little reproduction of part of it. He takes it directly from the flap copy here. So in Kovno, Russia, well, this is Kaunas, Lithuania, and that is in fact where he was born to Lithuanian Jewish parents. But Lithuania and Poland have both vanished into the Russian Empire in the formal book jacket of the book, which is published in like 64, 65 or something. And then what he does is he opened the book. This is the book he stops at, not Bruegel or Rembrandt, on painting printed in capital letters, taken from Alexandrian Greek named Maximus of Tyre. Well, I'll show you what he's talking about. He reproduces the entire text of the book. Another reason why I suppose he didn't translate it, because he took most of his poem from another source. Here, this is what the pages look like. Very few words, 7, 8, 9 words on a page, all in this kind of handwritten printing for which the graphic artist Ben Shahn was known. And once again, his line breaks exactly mimic the line breaks in the book. I went through page by page and he takes them straight out of the book. So he finds and stops at this one book. I'll get back to why I think he stops at this one book in just a moment, but I want to bring up a couple of other things here. This is what he typically does until the later poetry. He carefully gives the date and the place. Anyone who wants to say Miłosz isn't being topical, you don't want to be topical, you don't say where and when you wrote the poem. And he's meticulous about this, I think until sometime maybe in the 80s. I think after the Nobel Prize, he stops being so careful about it, but seeing when and where he wrote the poem. And then he comes up with a justification for this long, extensive passage, which I'll return to a little bit later. Someone may wonder if this is verse or prose and with what intention Miłosz puts chance words into print. Okay, I'm doing an experiment. People will criticize me for it. Is it a poem? Is it prose? What is it? I, though, would prefer to be beyond verse and prose, beyond intention and justification. Well, here the conditional tells you he would prefer to, but he's not there yet. This poem isn't successful in the kind of synthesis he wants to do. And again, I'll talk about that later. So we've run through all of these quotations that seemingly defy the standard Polish line, at least, about the degree of his engagement in specifically Californian culture in the 60s. all you have to do is look at the epigraphs to Visions of San Francisco Bay. That's how the English translation was. It's Widzenia nad Zatoką San Francisco, which is 1969. So it's really set up to be a capstone to his experience in Berkeley in the 60s. So if you just go through the epigraphs, what sources is he using to locate these essays on contemporary American and Californian and Berkeley culture? As I said, he has several pages dedicated just to this street preacher, Holy Hubert. So some of them, usual suspects, if you know Miłosz: Baudelaire, Swedenborg. Baudelaire, of course, Wandering Through the City. That's the prototype for the poem. Swedenborg, Oscar Miłosz, Robinson Jeffers. Where else does he find sources here? He gets a slogan from a campus poster. I'll give that to you in a minute. A passage that he translates himself from Allen Ginsberg's Howl. He has this love-hate relationship with Allen Ginsberg's poetry, 1956. An excerpt from an article on sex education in the San Francisco Chronicle from, I think, 1966. A quote from Raymond Dasman's pioneering ecological tract. He was reading all this stuff like Silent Spring, Rachel Carson, all this kind of stuff. Raymond Dasman writes a book called The Destruction of California, 1965. That's about the physical degradation of the California landscape. So he has a quote in there from that. And bathroom graffiti. One of them, he cites something that's from a Berkeley men's room wall. Due to lack of interest, tomorrow is canceled. So apocalypse on the bathroom wall. But the most startling epigraphs are not in the English version at all. He has one chapter that's omitted from the essay collection when it comes into English. It's 1975, so it's a little while later, but it's also because I think the chapter is intended for a Polish audience. It's called, if I'm remembering correctly, simply Czarni, blacks. And it's trying to introduce a Polish public to the Black Panther movement, to the situation of blacks in America. Some of his remarks are very prescient. Some of them clearly mark him as being a person of his time and place from his origins. But they also point to his readings. One of them, he quotes the Black Panther leader, Eldridge Cleaver, a little remark to Ronald Reagan that I do not have in my written version of this because it's not language I ordinarily use, but I hope you're not recording, but I'm quoting Czesław Miłosz, quoting Eldridge Cleaver. You can kiss my black ass. So that's an epigraph to his book. And the second is portions of a Black Panther manifesto taken from what he says was one of the most curious, odd, interesting forms of reading he encountered in the 60s, the famous, perhaps the most famous underground newspaper, the Berkeley Barb. And again, you can find, there's a whole web archive of famous underground newspapers from the 60s and 70s. So I actually could go back and check his stuff. So what Ginsberg once said to him, as Miłosz kind of proudly recalls on multiple occasions, I guess you're not as much of a square as you seem. Yeah, that's about the size of it. Okay, so what's he doing with all these quotations though? Why are they all coming together? And why do they, in some sense, are not all come together, as he seems to admit in the conclusion there? Well, more quotes from very specific sources give some ideas of this and help you to read what I think he's trying to do with the poem here. He writes, Jerzy Giedroyc in 70 says, I have the sense of participating in a planetary tragedy. I have the sense of participating in a planetary tragedy. And he locates the epicenter of this tragedy precisely in Berkeley. So what is this tragedy? What is this crisis? If you look at his poem, Dużo śpię, I sleep a lot, 1962, he says, I sleep a lot and read St. Thomas of Aquinas or The Death of God, parentheses, that's a Protestant book. Well, it's more than just a Protestant book. It's a book by Gabriel Vahanian, I think is the name, that comes out in the 60s. That was the beginning of a whole Death of God movement in American theology. It made the cover of Time magazine. He's plugged in exactly to what's happening in American theology. He's also a fan, this stuff just killed me because this was deja vu all over again from my childhood and my adolescence. He specifically talks in a later source about being a big fan of the Mr. Natural cartoons. And I would ask, if we weren't on a cyber thing, how many people even know who Mr. Natural is anymore? For me, it's like, this is what I grew up on. It's the artist who did the Grateful Dead, trucking thing. I wrote a paper in college about Caliban in The Tempest and called it Mr. Natural. He was ubiquitous. But they were called the Mystic Funnies when they came out in book form. This is Mr. Natural right here. We'll get to that in a minute. He also says in Visions of San Francisco Bay that he was an avid reader of Mad Magazine. Again, for me, this is deja vu all over again. And another thing this reminds us of that I don't think scholarship really thinks about, but I do. He had 2 teenage sons in Berkeley. Both of his kids attended Berkeley high schools, went on to college at UC Berkeley. This Mad Magazine would have been around his house. I 100% guarantee it. That's how I got in on it. And there's a cover from the Berkeley Barb. And I'll mention the logo, the masthead for the Berkeley Barb, again, when I try and synthesize this. I don't want to go on too long here. I even tracked down the one reference to Czesław Miłosz in the Barb when I was prowling around on this underground newspaper website. But the next source I want to give here is something, and here I actually cite specifically Joanna Nijińska in the written form of this essay, which hasn't appeared in print yet. Another source that I would bet, I'd bet anyone $5 I'm right on this one. Another source for this that's both East Coast and West Coast, which is Frank O'Hara. Now, Joanna wrote a really wonderful essay about Frank O'Hara and post-1989 Polish poetry, talking about how later poets use Frank O'Hara, this sort of self-consciously casual mode, to rebel against Miłosz and his generation's high seriousness as they saw it. But my guess would be, and again, I'll bet anyone $5 that I'm right on this one, is that this is one of the books he picked up in one of his strolls. He prowled the Berkeley bookstores on a regular basis. It shows up in his books. Because Frank O'Hara's lunch poems came out in 1964, and it was published by Lawrence Ferlinghetti at City Lights in the Bay. I have, this goes way back. I've had a little pocket edition of that for a very long time. So my guess would be he pulls this book out, sees a different model for writing. He's looking for a loose, baggy, new form of writing to accommodate, among other things, as he writes, I think, to Andrzejewski, he needs to find a new kind of writing to accommodate California. And he would have seen, pick up the book, he sees something like this. I walk up the muggy street beginning to sun and have a hamburger and a malted and buy an ugly New World writing to see what the poets in Ghana are doing these days. And in the Golden Griffin, I get a little Verlaine for Patsy with drawings by Bernard, although I do think of Hesiod translated Richard Lattimore or Brendan Behan's new play or Le Balcon or Les Nez of Genet, but I don't. I stick with Verlaine. Strolling around, stopping in a bookstore, browsing in the bookstore, and integrating whatever you pick up in the bookstore into the poem. So this seems to be Miłosz's only foray into I do this, I do that mode of poetry, the Frank O'Hara mode of poetry. And as I suggested, I think he's trying to pick, as he says himself, to Giedroyc, the baggiest form possible so he can say something different about California as the backdrop against which events have played out or still playing out. California is the epicenter of whatever monumental changes are taking place globally at his time. And we'll see him, or if you know Miłosz, you know he does manage to do this thing of create a baggy form that integrates the West Coast, Vilnius, Polish history, and so forth in his epic From the Rising of the Sun from 73, 74. So I don't want to go on too long here. I'll try and sort of summarize what I see him trying to do here and why I think it's significant, so I can leave some room for questions. But what he's trying to do, as I see it, is look at what is not simply a political crisis, but a metaphysical crisis in Berkeley as well as in his own writing. I have a quote here. I can't find it, but he says, he thinks that in one of his letters, he says, I think American politics is a rich way to explore religious issues. Politics and religion are united. The works he's citing, I mentioned his Death of God. He has that appeared up, Gabriel Vahanyan's Death of God, 1961. He quotes elsewhere the wall graffiti, Nietzsche is dead, God is dead, Nietzsche, you know, even I knew that one. It's another epigraph. Telegraph Avenue is, among other things, asking the big theological questions, but maybe not asking them right. That seems to be one thing he's suggesting. In Visions from San Francisco Bay, he says, they ignore Hubert because Holy Hubert. He's sympathetic to him, but because he's not engaging with them now. He's talking to them from another diction, another language, another time. So he doesn't make it. Metaphysics. May the baby Jesus shut your mouth and open your mind. This for him is not an idle question, you know, or an idle invocation. Maximus of Tyre, all the way through, what Ben Shahn says himself in the introduction is that Maximus of Tyre, about whom I knew nothing except that he inspired some American poetry in the 50s. This is from 63. He says he's an eclectic Platonist of the 2nd century AD and talks about him as someone who embraces conflict, synthesizes conflict, rather than simply taking one position or another. But God himself, the father and fashioner of all that is, older than time, or whatever the rest of the quote is here. So the theological, the idea of being a polemicist, engaged with your times and synthesizing multiple things is even built into the Maximus of Tyre, who brings up, if you look at it here, if a Greek is stirred by the remembrance of God, by the art of Phidias, an Egyptian by paying worship to animals, another man by a river, another by fire, I have no anger for their divergences, synthesizing these multiple positions. And it gives him a model for metaphysically inflected realism, is my argument. He has a much later poem called Realism. He says, splendor, this is Miłosz now in translation, certainly incomprehensible, touches a cracked wall, a refuse heap, the floor of an inn, jerkins of the rustics, a broom and 2 fish bleeding on a board. Rejoice, give thanks. Even if we go down here to these seemingly extraneous sources, I've mentioned the graffiti, God is dead, Nietzsche, Nietzsche is dead, God. Here, the character here is saying, what do you mean there's signs and omens everywhere, Mr. Natural? Don't get it. Oh, well, skip it, flaky foont. I don't know who flake, but you see the angel with the trumpet right up here in the corner. Another one of the comic books that I found online is set in Death Valley, a setting for, I think it's in Across Our Lands. I forget the names of the translation, Pozemianashi. That Death Valley is a setting for one of the poems. And in Death Valley, Mr. Natural sees visions of the apocalypse. So even in these really goofy sources, and go over to the Berkeley Barb, what do you have up on the logo? One of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. He's seeing metaphysical crisis written into the political crisis, written into the daily physical environment in which he's involved. Another thing you'll notice from all of them is this emphasis on the word as visual image. All of these sources he's drawing on combine word and visual image, from Ben Shahn, the noted graphic artist, as I've said, to the psychedelic posters. You know, later he makes references to the comic books and so forth. I want to point to a common source here, and I'll use this to kind of draw this to a close, to suggest where he finds common ground and sort of a playing field for productive disagreement or productive argument with his environs here. Word, visual image, carefully handwritten letters that that are intended not to look like print and so forth. Well, where does that all go back to? It's William Blake. What I've done here is combine, this is the frontispiece from his Songs of Innocence and Experience. This is an illustration to Jacob's Ladder. And this is a poster that my husband possesses, but does not have the money right now to frame, by the poster artist Bob Schnepf. I think you can see the similarities even visually here, the kind of sort of Judeo-Grecian garb these people are wearing, the trumpets they're blowing, these distinctly kind of feminine figures in flowing robes. This one is an angel here. These aren't angels, but they're set against the backdrop of what looks like a radiant sun, playing, you know, with zithers and trumpets, just as they are here. Even some of the gestures seem to be mimicking this drawing here. And I checked that out. There's been a lot of work done on this, actually. Blake's influence on the 50s and 60s counterculture in specifically in the San Francisco Bay. The Beat poets adored him. I already mentioned Allen Ginsberg. Ginsberg was a big Blakean. Ben Shahn adored him. He picked his publishing house precisely because they did such beautiful reproductions of Blake. And the psychedelic artists adored him. So one of them, Stanley Mouse, actually said when he gets to art school, they show him Blake and he says, man, this is psychedelic. What was this guy on? So Blake is ubiquitous and Miłosz knows it. I brought in the Doors thing just because there's no Miłosz Morrison connection that I know of, but the Doors took their name from the Marriage of Heaven and Hell. The doors of perception were cleansed. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is. One of the aphorisms from the Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Jim Morrison famously wrote a master's thesis on Blake, but Miłosz did not read his master's thesis, as far as I know. So he tracks down this reference. He recognizes that his common ground. Here, let me see if I can find the quotation. Does he know about this Blake everywhere in the counterculture, the Beats, the hippies, the psychedelic artists? It would be hard not to. One UCLA professor said it would be impossible to track down a dorm room that didn't have a poster of Blake along with the psychedelic art. And he writes specifically about his relationship to the Blake of his contemporaries, his California American contemporaries, in Visions of San Francisco Bay. This is what he says. If today's opponents of impersonal, repressive, inhuman knowledge, technology, one of the things the hippies are rebelling against, are quick to cite William Blake, he says, I am with them. But he adds, I find in them something different than they do. And here I'm quoting again from Miłosz. The intellect that oppressed Blake renounced impulse in favor of the fixed laws of matter and renounced ascending movement in both of these visual images in favor of inertia. Newton's physics, this is a common theme in Miłosz, horrified Blake because he saw them as a declaration of subjection, our subjection to what is. Since things as they are as they are, there is no choice in matter. What he's doing is tracking, whether he's doing it consciously or not, he's synthesizing a whole range of responses, among other things, to William Blake, and defining his own position in Blake, as he comes to later in The Land of Oro, written in the 70s, as a metaphysical response to, but not a complete rejection of the physical environment around him, quite the opposite. He's responding to the transcendent metaphysical, however crudely they're expressed, an apocalyptic sense that reverberates throughout Californian culture that he places at the heart of his own vision. I'll just summarize here. I won't be able to get all of it. Where this really all comes together is in from the Rising of the Sun, 1973-74, where once again we have the bookstore. He says to I think it's Jerzy Andrzejewski in a letter, you know, these wonderful bookstores, the best bookstores in the world. I feel like I've come back to my student Vilnius when he's writing from Berkeley. The bookstore shows up again in Vilnius, a sort of symbolically charged vision of a bookstore in The Rising of the Sun. The narrow street just opposite the university was called, in fact, Literary Lane. On the corner, a bookstore, but not books, just sheaves of paper up to the very ceiling, unbound, tied with string, print and handwriting. Think about all the images you've seen. In Latin, Cyrillic script and Hebrew letters from 100, 300 years ago. What he's doing is adding another layer to this bookstore, which is a work in endless progress. It's not a bound book, it's an unfinished text in which he's incorporating a whole new series of texts, the ones that he's bringing up here. And he finally synthesizes Blake, Berkeley, and Apocalypse, the apocalyptic time, apocalypse as an eternal present acting out and intersecting with the material world. At the end here, I won't quote it all, but he quotes from Blake's Milton, and then he says, what year is this? Again, the question of years from 100, 300 years ago. It's easy to remember. This is the year when eucalyptus forests froze in our hills, Berkeley Hills. In the morning, we were cutting logs with a chainsaw. Below, the bay, the playful sun, and the towers of San Francisco seen through rusty fog. So there we have the convergence of the Berkeley setting, the Blakean vision, and apocalyptic time fusing with present day time. And I'm going to just end with kind of a throwaway point that enters into my larger project I didn't have room for here. He has a poem from 1962 called, in the English translation, Far West. In Polish, it's titled something much more significant, and for whatever reason, he chose not to try and replicate that. It's called Kresy, Borderlands. He's taking a Californian gold mining landscape in the poem and merging it with Renaissance Sri Lanka pastoral, Polish pastoral, to create a vision of a borderlands that encompasses both California and Lithuania, the Polish-Lithuanian border. And I won't go into this here, but I'm just going to throw out my last Berkeley reference here. I did some digging around. He has very specific references to California history and to the Hispanic conquest of the West Coast and of the Southwest, as opposed, Miłosz incorporates this into his poetry. He has Dnipro Sera features in the poetry, in the essays. He has Cabeza de Vaca in, I think it's in Throughout Our Lands, that's how it's translated, Podziemie Nasze. Where does this all come from? Well, one thing that I'm guessing he knew, and I'll bet, again, I'll bet $5, is that in the 1920s, Berkeley was the center of a new school of historiography. He did know the scholarship of people around him at Berkeley. That's something you can verify. He did use that library like nobody's business. And the library was named for Hubert Bancroft, the famous Romantic historian, whose work Miłosz also knew, who did Romantic historiography of California. But the Borderlands School of History that was founded by Herbert Bolton in Berkeley in the 60s specifically did exactly what Miłosz follows up on and says, wait a minute, we've got our history wrong. We are not Anglo-Americans derived from the East Coast. Our part of the world, which was as thoroughly colonized by the Spanish as the East Coast was by Northern Europeans, has a different history that moves from the West. And he starts building, as I see it, on Bolton. He does almost quote Bolton verbatim on Dnipro Sera and Cabeza de Vaca. They're both chapters in Bolton's book from the 20s. So that's yet another dimension of the project of Miłosz in California, and I'll end with that.
Wonderful. Claire, do you think you can stop screen sharing?
Yes, I'm actually capable of stopping screen sharing. I've practiced in my class. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Claire. I'll give you some virtual applause for your talk.
Thank
We really appreciate it. What I would like to invite people to do is we can take questions in the chat and I can read them, or you can just put in the chat that you're raising your hand and I will call on you and you can offer your question to Claire on the screen. So either way. And I think our first question is going to come from Joanna Nijińska.
Claire, I cannot wait for this book, and I think it's an extremely important subject because, and a very needed work. Polish scholars indeed write a lot about Miłosz, but cannot, with your type of sensibility, cultural sensibility, see things that surrounded him and be able to read what he encoded. So I think that this is also a trend in Polish scholarship. The same is happening with your mentor, Stanisław Barańczak, whose American career and whose American environment has been now kind of discovered and reconstructed by his scholars. But it was a fantastic presentation, and I really love this inscription of popular culture onto his writing. And, you know, I was always thinking about Miłosz's California as two things, you know, his distaste for kids burning books on Berkeley campus, and his great admiration for Robinson Jeffers. And there's one word that was never articulated, and you never spoken this one word, which seemed to me crucial about Miłosz's relationship with California. But of course, now I can see how limited it was, which is nature. That Miłosz was so interested in non-human, right? In this Robinson Jeffers as a poet of choking galaxies and the universe. And I was always thinking about his relationship with California as his escape from the historical, from this pressure to be constantly this poet who addresses the historical. So I was wondering if you were willing to comment maybe how we could connect everything that you just told us about his relationship with the material culture, with popular culture, the inscription of the metaphysical onto the popular imagery, with his great fascination with the non-human, which again I read as a desire to escape from history.
I think well, as you know, he argues with Robinson Jeffers. This is something I was talking with Jane Hirschfeld, the great California poet who was friends with Miłosz, and who's also just like one of my favorite poets and a completely fabulous human being. We actually bonded in Lithuania. The only place I get to know American poets is in Poland or Lithuania. Anyhow, she said he loved California enough to argue with it. And I thought that was just about right. She said if he really cared about something, he fought. And we both talked about moments where Miłosz was provoking us to argue and we were being kind of good, polite Americans and not taking the bait, when he was just dying for us to lay into whatever he'd said, or and moments of regret with not arguing when he wanted an argument. He's arguing with the California landscape, and he's also arguing all the way through. This is where I think he brings Polish, Lithuanian, European history to bear on the American landscape. On the one hand, it's inhuman. There's that dimension of it. On the other hand, what he's always calling attention to, and this is where you can track this preoccupation with Native Americans going back to him reading Fenimore Cooper as a child in an abridged one-volume Polish translation. He compares Lithuanians to Native Americans, the last Christianized people in Europe, the closest to paganism and so forth. That prefaces the last chapter of Captive Mind, a passage about the conquest of Mexican Native American culture by the Spanish as comparable to the Soviets taking over Lithuania and so forth. He's got that thread running through, but he actually does homework. And part of his homework is to say pretending that a land is natureless means to ignore its history. Saying that a land has no history, and he has a beautiful passage I love from The Rising of the Sun, where he's identifying the flora and fauna along the Rogue River. Now, all of this stuff, I always get this little pang of nostalgia just reading about it, because we camped on the Rogue River when I was a kid. He does the etymology of the Rogue River. He says it came from the French calling the river, my French pronunciation sucks, but nobody's paying me to speak French, La Rivière des Coquins. The Native Americans are the rogues on the river, so it's a French name, displacing whatever name it was originally called. And he finds a flower called the Alpine Shooting Star, and he traces it back. I looked up these things. It's just really fun. He goes back and says, you know, this is the name in Latin, because he has early passions as a botanist. We'll never know what the native name for this flower was. It's not an alpine shooting star. There are no Alps. This is Oregon. These are plants that were first recognized by the previous inhabitants. So he does kind of both things. On the one time, you know, there's the cliffs dropping into the Pacific Ocean that he drives up and down. There's the brutal, inhuman Death Valley, but he tracks the histories of the guy who settled, you know, has this one, I forget his name, the guy who had a weird ranch out in the middle of Death Valley. He talks about, you know, native settlers, or Cabeza de Vaca encountering Native Americans. I think Cabeza de Vaca went from Florida, ended up in California. I can't remember now. But he's always saying, let's go back. Is it historyless, or is it history that we've written over, that we've chosen to ignore? So he's constantly challenging the American myth of Scotty's Ranch. Thank you, David Goldfarb. That's exactly it. I went there as a kid. Scotty's Ranch. Yeah, he talks about Scotty's Ranch. So he's doing a dialogue about it's in a way it's very prescient, because he's doing post-colonial California avant la lettre. He does a critical interpretation of Junipero Serra, who I know, I went to Catholic school, I went to public school, no matter where you went, Junipero Serra was the sort of secular or literal saint of California, who established the chain of missions and quote unquote civilized the native peoples. He challenges that because he comes from Lithuania, in effect, and he knows what it means to have foreign overlords conquer your country and take over the culture. You know, Teutonic Knights, anyone, the first invasion of Teutonic Knights in Lithuania, the Christianization, forcible Christianization of Lithuania. So that's the way he's doing it all the time, is kind of this back and forth. It's inhuman, but we only know it through human interpretations of it. And he even reads Robinson Jeffers as a Scottish Protestant. This is a Scottish Protestant vision of nature, not nature as it is, but nature as it's seen by a kind of temperament that's alien to him.
Thanks for that, Claire. Leah, I think you have a question.
Yeah, thanks. Claire, I just really appreciated hearing, especially about your sort of research project. It's like a treasure hunt, and it's also very—
Oh, it's so fun, yeah.
Yeah, it's encouraging.
Frustrating, but fun, yeah.
Really encouraging to hear such a positive perspective on doing research on the internet, which is something I think a lot of us need to hear these days. No, I appreciate that.
Oh yeah. Well, even archives are up on the internet.
Yeah.
You know, there's all sorts of stuff you can find on the internet.
Yeah, which is a good reminder to keep looking that way. And to a certain extent, you answered part of the question that I'm going to ask with your response to Anna, but I maybe can rephrase and come at it in a slightly different way. This seems to me, particularly the poem that you sort of dissected for us, that is a sort of decidedly local perspective. He's walking through the streets of Berkeley. He's sort of as part of this quotidian routine, and it's also your perspective as one of the locals as well. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the other side. Is there an emigre sensibility, a Polish sensibility at play here? Is this an outsider's view of California, an insider's view, simultaneously both?
It's distinctly an outsider's view. One thing I don't remember where this quote is, but one thing he does in his vision of Americanness, and again, recent decades have done a lot of work on this, is he's strongly aware of the hyphenate nature of American writing. William Carlos William is English and partly Portuguese, I think. That's where the Carlos comes from. Coming to America and saying, why do we use, he hits Williams at a couple of key points in his development. And he read in the American Grain, this series of essays on the founding of America and on key episodes in American history in the late 40s, I think. And then he talks really briefly, just in passing, about the epic Patterson, which is about an epic about a small town life with all sorts of banalities and everyday existence. You know, take a tiny place and make it the center of your imaginative universe. And so this whole thing about the hyphenate identity, he's kind of aware that the outsider's perspective is partly a distinctly American perspective. So that being inside and out of the tradition, engaged with it, critical of it, and bringing an outsider's eye to it, but doing it in Polish automatically makes it different. And every one of these words that I mentioned is inflected differently because he's making the Polish readers do their homework. They don't know what a happening is. They don't know what a psychedelic poster is. He puts them in English. He's when I'm reading Miłosz, what I'm always thinking about is where he's writing it? Where is it going to be published? Who does he anticipate reading it? Because he complains about lack of readership. But at the same time, he's publishing them in Polish with Giedroyc in the hope of them making it to some sort of Polish audience. So you kind of say, who's he writing to? Who is he writing against? When he tells Giedroyc, I'm so Californian, get over it. I'm not, as he calls it, he says, nie jestem zawodowym Polakiem. I'm not a professional Pole. I'm a Californian writer now. He's getting pissed off at Giedroyc. He's in an argument with Giedroyc. So he's always, you know, arguing for and against his interlocutor, whether real or imagined. And this poem is kind of, I think, doing a wake-up call, saying, you guys, you think it's all happening there. It's not. The dance, the mystery, the secret of the universe is unfolding where I am right now. And you have to learn this world if you're going to be able to interpret your world.
David Goldfarb has a question. Oops, let's see if David can unmute.
Oh,
There he is.
And I'm unmuted. Okay. Hi, Claire. Great, fantastic talk. It's a topic that I've touched on myself in a paper I wrote some years ago on various peripatetic Polish poets. And
you can send me the reference. I'd appreciate it.
I will. In fact, talked about Miłosz as a California poet in part of my introduction to my new series, Encounters with Polish Literature, that you'll be on in 6 months, talking about Szymborska. And one thing I was thinking about in that is, Miłosz was kind of characterized from around the time of the Captive Mind as an exile, and there's some moment when he's like, obviously no longer an exile. I mean, is he an expat or is he something else? In Visions of San Francisco Bay, there's that line toward the beginning where he says, the majestic expanse of the Pacific seacoast has imperceptibly worked its way into my dreams, remaking me, stripping me down, and perhaps thereby liberating me. Maybe that's liberating him from history, as Joanna suggests, or perhaps something else. And I'm wondering, if you have a sense, since you've done this in much more depth than I have, of when that perception, changes from being, exiled a California poet or something else. I mean, I'm thinking comparing him to, say, Solzhenitsyn, who never becomes, an American in any sense. I mean, it's really just two completely different things. And I'm wondering, if you can, like, thinking about him as an Americanist in Poland, I mean, maybe like coming to California is more like arrival than exile. I mean, that's maybe he was never an exile in America and only was an exile in Paris, or what? Do you have a kind of a read on that timeline?
Well, the whole thing of exile is such a symbolically charged word, not just in the Polish tradition, but for the modern writer, that he does have notes from exile. He returns that over and over again, but it's metaphysically charged as well. And he tracks in his writing various points. He said he went into exile the minute he left Lithuania for Warsaw at one point. That was the beginning of his. And if you think of his early poem Spotkania, an encounter, where is it all gone? Where is it all? And that's kind of built into the sort of elegiac mode of modern in the broadest sense writing. Where are the snows of yesteryear, Vion, the lost world. But so I think he needs exile as a metaphysical term to begin with. But I think with Miłosz being in a way a born, I hate to say multiculturalist because it's so cliche now, but he's somebody who works constantly to undermine the notion of pure origins. It's part of his resistance to Polishness. He tracks his own, including like a super impure document from the Rising of the Sun that's written in macaronic Eastern Slavic inflected. This is the one time I was glad I was subjected to 2 years of historical linguistics and structure of modern Russian, and all of this is you can get all of the things that are in this text that apparently he found in a Berkeley library that's going back to whatever, it's 16th century, 17th century, I think, is that there is no originary source, that he's not dealing with pure Polish language. When he traces back the history of his own family, he notices something that I wouldn't have thought of, is that Miłosz is a name of South Slavic derivation, even if you think Milosevic, which I just, good Lord. Yeah, so he's saying, you don't get back to the pure point of origin. So exile is kind of built into the project from begin with. It's also, in his work as an Americanist, he says Sienkiewicz gets the trilogy out of Fenimore Cooper, Walter Scott and Fenimore Cooper, and that Sienkiewicz gets the trilogy because he's been traveling in the American West and brings the stories of the American West back to what becomes kind of the, I don't know what to call it, the would-be originary tale of Polish greatness before the loss of empire. So in a way, he kind of won't let anything rest where it is. And just to give one weird little example that's not quite there, I couldn't believe it in The Year of the Hunter, his redacted diary that he publishes in whatever, 80-something, 82, I can't remember. He talks about going to Hawaii on vacation. And I thought, this is so Miłosz. And reading on the beach in Honolulu, he's reading a history of the indigenous Hawaiian royalty. Like, who goes to the beach in Honolulu and has to find out who was really there first, what the real story is. It's not a tourist site. You did that too?
I live in Hawaii, so I'm in
Oh,
Honolulu,
yeah,
and I have all of those books.
Oh, you live there. You live there, though. That's different. He went for vacation. I have never sat there and said, well, I haven't been to Hawaii since I was 9, so I wouldn't have been reading. And I've forgotten. Yeah, of course you're in Hawaii. Yeah, but he just goes there on one vacation and says, well, I'm lying here on the beach in Honolulu reading the history of, now you're going to help me with pronunciation, Queen Liliuokalani. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. I'm reading her history and the history of her, and reading her genealogy. So tracing origin stories that are never final is part of, I think, his project as a writer, which means you're always not quite wherever you are.
Thanks. I like that.
Any other questions? Joanna, would you like another one?
Yeah, could I ask a question on the Lithuanian side about the 17th century in 1911? Do you think it was about kind of going back to the Commonwealth, multi-ethnic, multi-denominational, and so on population, or was it something about kind of the magical thinking of the region to which he refers so often in his poetry?
I think you're right on both counts, actually. I think part of it, he's always hearkening back, and when he does mythologizing, it's always veering towards the side of an all-embracing multicultural Lithuania, the kind that you get. He's kind of taking Pantadeusz and pushing it one step further, because Pantadeusz has the Jewish artist / innkeeper ends up being the de facto keeper of Polish history, the great improviser, he's the one who synthesizes everything, but you don't have a single word there in any language that's not Polish. And even Jankel speaks pretty pure Polish, Mickiewicz says. Miłosz is taking that one step further by saying, let's give 4 different names for the same region. Let's track, we're not going to let one take priority over the other. We're going to have all these things coexisting, that there isn't one name for any place in Lithuania. There, 4, 5, 6 in multiple languages. So that's part of what he's doing. And part of it, is he's enamored of the magical thinking of a pagan culture that's still surviving into the Christian era. And part of it too is the myth of Vilnius, the myth of Lithuania only evolves when he's in exile. When he's in Vilnius, when you read his documents from that period, he can't wait to get out of this provincial backwater. It's only with Dolina Isy, which he wrote, the Isy Valley, his quasi-autobiographical, it's really a hypothetical autobiography. What if he had stayed? What might his life have been? He writes that under the influence of William Faulkner. He's been obsessively reading Faulkner for a few years in his first American stay, and the idea of a complex, dynamic, tainted little backwater that's been washed through by history, he takes from Faulkner, and he actually translates one story of Faulkner in its entirety. It's in the Beinecke archive. That's exactly about that, about the land is always tainted. You want to go back to your primeval pure origins, but history taints even the most seemingly innocent of landscapes.
You're weaving things so beautifully. We are mesmerized here, I think, listening to these answers. May I have one more comment, Elizabeth, or do you have other? I was also thinking about what David said about the arrival to California, linking it to a question of arrival and exile, all these binaries that we are using, linking it to his relationship to Polish language. He always claimed, and this is very clear in his relationship to Białoszewski, that he is a poet who doesn't know the central mainstream Polish, that his Polish is always on periphery. And there's some kind of almost like a complex in relationship to someone like Białoszewski, who reenacts orality and really knows the language from a completely different perspective that he does. And I was wondering if California isn't just another periphery, just another way of being comfortable, of not being in the center. It's the edge of the continent.
Yeah, I think that's one reason why he does the Kresy talk and recuperating different cultures, hidden in California. But I think what you're getting at with Białoszewski is interesting. It's not, he doesn't know the central dialect, and he doesn't know contemporary Polish. He's cut off from contemporary Polish, spoken on the streets. Exactly the stuff, the stuff that you've written about, and that Białoszewski does so beautifully is all the slang, the new language that evolves in people's Poland, the way people talk on the streets, that kind of stuff. He hasn't that's not available to him, but he does. There's a beautiful book by my colleague and emeritus professor of English at Northwestern, Lawrence Lipkin, called The Life of the Poet. And it's about how poets shape their life as they keep writing it and rewriting it and rewriting it through their work. And he tracks different phases. He's doing Anglo-American poets, but he does ones that Miłosz really likes. He does Blake, he does Whitman, he does Eliot, he does people who are, so it makes for an interesting sort of combined reading. And he says what the modern poet does is take their little province and make it the center of the universe. So it's like inferiority and superiority at the same time. It's like, oops, I come from a backwater, but hey, my backwater is where it's all happening. And you see him doing it once again with California, which seems like it's on the periphery where it's expansive. It's not, he did find one of the few places you can actually walk around in California, downtown Telegraph Avenue, which now, the last time I was there, had been completely taken over by Armani Exchange and Gap and mattress stores. And, you know, it's been a while, but is no longer this hodgepodge of head shops and bookstores and, you know, all of this kind of stuff that was there when back in the late 70s when I knew it.
Claire, can you repeat the title of the book of your colleague?
The Life of the Poet, The Life of the Poet by Lawrence Lipkin.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I love it. It's very short and it covers so much in ways that are really evocative for Miłosz.
Yeah, he was certainly self-fashioning, right?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. And the thing of modeling himself on Mickiewicz and rewriting Mickiewicz and figuring out what do you do if your life is, this is one of the shaping things in the biography, which will be finished. I'm hoping I will not have to conclude it posthumously. It's going super slowly, translating and writing a biography of Miłosz at the same time. Anyhow, is what do you do when your life doesn't fit the right model? You know, when you don't die on the barricades, or you live a long life that's seemingly crowned with every kind of external success you could imagine. That's not the Polish poet's life. That's not the way it's supposed to go. And the life of the survivor who actually gets through one ordeal after another and succeeds in objective measures, it doesn't work. So he has to do a lot of creative engineering to rethink how his life looks.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Clare Cavanagh. Oops, I'm sorry, David, did you have something you wanted to
Yeah,
share?
the story of Hawaii. I have to see if that's the one that Miłosz read now.
I just wanted to give you the references. I happen to have it on the shelf.
It may have been the one. Check the publication date and send it to me along with your reference to your article about peripatetic Polish poets. Yeah, another category that Yałaszewski would fit into, you know, occasionally sauntering out into the city.
This edition is 1990, but obviously she wrote it, you know, maybe in the teens or something like that.
Okay, I bet you just scored another footnote here. I'm going to get that one in for sure. I found track down his history.
I'll send it to you.
Super. Claire, I want to thank you so much for joining us today for the Wiles lecture. We so appreciate this really interesting look at Miłosz, and we hope to see you again very soon.
Well, thank you very, very much for engineering this in spite of all the obstacles and for waiting until I got my wireless and my electricity back. God, I'm still kind of sweating, actually. That was awful. Okay, well, thank you all very much. Thank you, Joanna, for sticking this out too. And thanks for putting it all together.
Wonderful. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.